This is David Kilcullen, who has been, in the past few years, a very important part of the U.S. government's attempt to get right what it got so spectacularly wrong in the early years of the Iraq War. He was senior counterinsurgency advisor to General David Petraeus in the early going of what was called the Surge in 2007. And after that, he became a special advisor to Secretary of State Rice on counterinsurgency. And before that, he was the State Department's chief strategist for counterterrorism. He's also been a colonel in the Australian Army, which will explain the funny accent. And he is most recently the author, actually, of a brand new book, and a really important book about warfare in the 21st century called The Accidental Guerrilla. So please welcome Dave Kilcullen to the summit. We're going to talk about the easy cases in the next 25 minutes, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Dave, the new administration came in saying we took our eye off the ball in Afghanistan. We need to focus on that war because that's the war that was prompted by 9/11 and that still matters for our own security because of where the global jihad is located. However, in the last, and Pakistan was considered a part of this new focus because the administration wanted to look at the effect that the border area was having on the war in Afghanistan with a safe haven for the Taliban on the Pakistani side. So they've got a new office of Richard Holbrooke, who is a special representative on Afghanistan and Pakistan. However, in the last few days or weeks, suddenly Pakistan has become the crisis that's on the front pages of the paper, and Afghanistan, let alone Iraq, has been sort of pushed to the side a bit. So I guess I want to ask you, do we have a policy on Pakistan, and what should our policy be? Given that we don't have any troops there, we've spent billions of dollars, and as you said recently in testimony before the House Armed Services Committee, we've seen a severe deterioration in security in Pakistan, a major increase in violence, extremism, and insurgency, a progressive loss of government control over population and territory, a spread of insurgency and terrorism, and continuing complicity by some elements of the Pakistani military and intelligence services with terrorists and insurgents in Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and elsewhere. This is our ally in the region that we're talking about. What can we do, if anything, to influence Pakistan in its own struggle, internally and externally, with insurgents and terrorists?
Well, I think the way that I would answer that is to say that Pakistan is neither an ally nor an enemy. It's not coherent enough to be either. It's a series of competing factions and interests, some of which are opposed to US interests, and some of which are actually pro-Western and pro-democratic. So, for example, the civil administration, that is the politicians and some of the civil servants, are actually very much opposed to the idea of a Taliban takeover of Pakistan. And Pakistan has a very free judiciary, it has a free press, there are a lot of good things going for Pakistan. The problem is it has a civilian administration that doesn't control its own national security establishment. And significant elements within the army and the intelligence service are actually backing the other side. And that's been a fundamental failure of our policy since really 2001. We've pretended that Pakistan is a weak but willing ally. And it's actually neither an ally nor an enemy. We have both enemies and friends in Pakistan.
Well, right now, President Zardari, President Karzai are both in Washington having talks with President Obama. Do you think President Obama has a new read on Pakistan and is seeing it in those complex terms that you just laid out? Do you think the new administration understands that this is not a client or an ally, but a country in a good deal of trouble on which we depend for certain things, but over which we don't have a great deal of influence?
I'm encouraged by what I see coming out of the Obama administration. I think that they understand the complexity and the difficulty of the problem. And if you think about what the president said in his speech at the end of March about Afghanistan-Pakistan strategy, he said there's no longer going to be a blank check for the Pakistani military. We're going to hold them accountable, and they need to decide effectively how committed they are to this. So I think the early signs are encouraging, but I would just add a cautionary note that this is probably the most difficult foreign policy problem, not only of this administration, but of the last 2 terms. And one of the reasons why it's so difficult now is because we didn't get it right since 2001.
Well, lay out for us a bit what a reasonable and a policy that has some chance of success would be. What we've done is poured money into the Pakistani military. It's spent most of that money on military hardware that's more suited for its state-against-state standoff with India than for an insurgency within its own borders. Should we attach conditions to the aid that we are sending Pakistan? The Obama administration is saying no right now, that it's the wrong time to start holding them accountable in that way because it will make their job more difficult at a moment of crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I've dealt with the Pakistani military and intelligence services in the field in Pakistan and also in a variety of diplomatic settings since I came to work for the US government. And, I mean, they're always like, I can change, baby, it's okay, and, you have people talking about, like, there's this severe push going on into Buner right now, and the Pakistani government saying, it's okay, we've changed, we've turned the corner. We've turned this particular corner so many times that we're going around in circles. So I feel like we do actually have to hold them accountable. We've spent $10.2 billion on the Pakistani military since 2001. In that time, the government's lost control of large parts of the country. The Pakistani military have lost, on a conservative estimate, about 70% of their engagements with the Taliban. Last year, NATO, which is the force running the operation in Afghanistan, lost 400 NATO vehicles on a supply route supposedly secured by the Pakistani military. So, I think we're entitled to say, what have we got for our $10 billion? And I think the answer is not very much.
But without soldiers in Pakistan and with a Pakistani army that's, to put it mildly, sensitive to foreign interference, can we redirect them toward counterinsurgency? This is an army that has no history of fighting insurgencies and that doesn't want to, because that means fighting fellow Muslims as opposed to infidels outside their borders.
I think that my personal view is that the army is probably too far gone. Firstly, they're past the point at which their bad performance can be explained by incompetence. There's more to it than that. So adding more resources to a strategy that's already failing is just going to make it fail faster. So my suggestion is that we actually reorient away from the army towards the police. In 2007, we spent $700 million on the Pakistani army and $4 million on the Pakistani police. So 99.6% of our effort went into the army. The police are the only element of the Pakistani security service that cares more about defeating the Taliban than it does about fighting India. And if you give them capabilities like forensics and investigative procedures and police weapons and so on, it's hard for them to turn that capability against somebody else, unlike the F-16s that we've been giving them. So I think that we need to shift away from the military towards the police, and we need to shift to civil administration and using the police to protect those guys. I also think we need to step back from fighting in the western part of the country and try and secure the parts of the country that the government still basically controls, which is east of the river.
You mean the tribal areas along the Afghan border where most of the fighting has happened? We're not there in troop presence, but we have unmanned drones that are hitting supposed high-value targets and also killing a fair number of Pakistani civilians. You recently made some controversy by saying we should call off the drones. Why do you think we should call off the drones? Since, according to today's New York Times interview with a young Taliban fighter, he said they've been really effective. We've been getting hit a lot.
What I would say is this. Since January 2006, we have killed 14 al-Qaeda leaders using the drones. In the same time frame, we've killed 700 Pakistani non-combatant civilians in the same area. So hang on a second, they're a major ally and we're bombing their population. We killed 700 non-combatant civilians in the last 3 years. That doesn't sit right for me. Secondly, though, I agree that it's damaging the Taliban and it's damaging Al-Qaeda. But it's also contributing to rising Punjabi militancy in the eastern part of the country. And when I think about Pakistan, it's like a sandcastle, and the sea's coming in and washing it away. And we've got a little pea shooter, and we're knocking toy soldiers off the top of it. It's irrelevant. You know, we're going to lose the country at this rate.
So you're saying we should stop playing hit the target in the mountains and instead think about helping the Pakistanis shore up the heavily populated areas east of the Indus River in the Punjab.
3 years ago when we started these strikes, the Pakistani Taliban didn't exist and the Afghan Taliban were confined to the frontier. Now they're 60 miles from the capital. So how well has that policy gone? You know, I would also say that's not to say that we shouldn't be striking some people. You know, there are some people out there who really need to be killed. You know, it's just a fact of life in the counterterrorism world. But you've got to have a higher hit rate than 14 bad guys for 700 civilians. That's a 2% accuracy rate.
Let's cross the border into Afghanistan, which has been the focus of the new president's foreign policy, going back to the campaign. We're going to see, 30,000 new American troops entering the theater over the next few months. Do we know what to do with them? Do we have a counterinsurgency strategy that will make use of those troops? Or are we just throwing some more soldiers into a conflict that has always had a kind of half-hearted commitment of resources and money, and are we going to just see them in a way going down the same blind alleys that we've seen in the south of Afghanistan in the last couple of years?
You know, we had this conversation once about Iraq, but my perspective is before you go committing troops, you need to commit some thought. And we have, that's kind of how we got into this problem in the first place. But in what we've done in southern Afghanistan, we've tried to fill in the gaps in an existing NATO strategy that isn't working. So if you look at where the US troops are going to go, they're going to fill the gaps in where the NATO troops are. That concerns me slightly because the NATO troops are mainly in the population centres, and that's actually where our guys need to be as well. One of our problems in Afghanistan is we've been chasing the bad guys instead of protecting the people. The reason that the people allow themselves to be manipulated by the Taliban is they don't feel safe. And if you don't make them feel safe, it doesn't matter how many bad guys you kill, they're still going to keep supporting whatever bad guys are out there. That was our big lesson in Iraq, and also in Afghanistan, actually, in the 05-06 timeframe. So I think it's about getting into the population centres and using the military as a delivery system to enable the civil authorities to do police work and economic development, rule of law, all the sorts of things that are going to make the people feel safe. That's a tough job, but it's not necessarily a combat job. It's a protective, almost like a heavy peacekeeping kind of a job.
But given how big and spread out the population of Afghanistan is, do we really have the ability, in league with the Afghan army and police, which the Afghan police are not quite the hopeful institution that maybe the Pakistani police are, but do we have the ability to provide security, or will the Taliban just always be there in a way that similarly to the Viet Cong in the 60s in South Vietnam?
We will never be able to provide security if we don't have the Afghan population on our side. Now, the good news is, right now, 65% of Afghans in the latest surveys have said they want the United States and the international community to stay in Afghanistan. They support our presence. And
after 8 years of war.
After 8 years of war. So 3 years ago, it was 85%. So it's come down. But, what's Barack Obama's approval rating in the States? It's about on the same level of approval as we have in Afghanistan.
And I can tell you there was not one day in Iraq when it was 65%.
Not close. I mean, you know what it was like. So I feel like, that's our seed corn. That's all we have to maneuver around in Afghanistan is the fact that Afghans still want us there. And you screw with that at your peril. And I think chasing the bad guys is not the way to go.
So you're saying more troops would be a good thing if they're used with a thoughtful strategy, which is securing the civilian population.
Right. And I guess the other point I'm making is we alone will never be able to secure Afghanistan. Working with the right Afghans and building the right Afghan capabilities, which are not just military, we might be in a position where they can secure the bulk of their position. Remember that we toppled the Taliban with less than 400 Americans on the ground in southern Afghanistan, but we had 50,000 Afghans fighting on our side. That's the difference.
Well, you sound a bit more hopeful about Afghanistan than about Pakistan. Unfortunately, the two are intimately related, and what happens in Pakistan is going to affect Afghanistan.
Afghanistan and Pakistan are like two mountaineers going up a cliff, and one of them's going okay, but they're roped together, you know? And if the Pakistanis slip off the cliff, they're going to pull Afghanistan with them.
Well, you've mentioned Iraq a couple of times, and I just want to bring it into the conversation because it risks becoming the forgotten war, which is what Afghanistan was for all those years. You were a key part of what became, I think, a really historic turnaround in a war that seemed to be lost in early 07. I mean, I was there in January 07, and pretty much everyone except for a few true believers thought that we need to figure out simply how to cut our losses here. But now, 2 years later, 2.5 years later, with all that we've heard about stability coming to parts of Iraq that, frankly, one thought were lost for decades, we're seeing massive suicide bombings again, dozens of people being killed every day. And we're also hearing that the Iraqi government has not, let's say, enthusiastically honored its commitments to the Sunni armed groups who became a key part of rolling back the insurgency. So the question is how much leverage and influence will the United States have over the direction things take in Iraq, given that we have absolutely committed ourselves, and we are committed by the security agreement with Iraq, to have all combat troops out of the cities by this summer and out of the country by August of 2010, which is actually not very far off.
Yeah. No, we are seeing a pretty substantial uptick in violence in Iraq. The worst that it ever got was September to December 2006. And in those months, about 3,000 Iraqi civilians were being killed by the enemy or by militant ethnic cleansing every week. Every night in Baghdad was 100 or 150 Iraqi civilians being killed by the enemy. So, you know, by the time we got it down to the level where we finished it up, it was 1 or 2 people a night. You know, so we dramatically reduced, and violence was down by 98%.
And since we're on this, I mean, just for a couple of minutes, describe what you saw and what you and General Petraeus and the American forces did in those key months of early 07 to make that tremendous change.
Well, I mean, the first thing we did was we tried to analyse what was creating the violence, which ironically is something that people hadn't done before. People had said, these guys are religious fanatics and they're evildoers, was the term that was often used, and they're just bad. It's bad folks, you know.
I think dead enders was...
Yeah, as another term. Yeah. We went in and we said, let's just look at what's actually driving this violence. And our diagnosis was that the Sunni community felt like the Shia were going to slaughter them because of the Samarra bombing. And Al-Qaeda...
That was the bombing of the Golden Mosque in February 2006, which did pretty much unleash full-scale civil war.
Absolutely,
in Iraq.
Yep. And so there was this runaway cycle of violence where the Sunnis felt like the Shia were going to massacre them. And Al-Qaeda had managed to portray themselves as the only thing standing between the Sunnis and oblivion. And so the Sunni community felt like they had to solidify behind Al-Qaeda because they were the only guys protecting them, because we were not. Yeah.
What were we doing?
We were just sitting out in these FOBs, the forward operating bases outside town. That's not true of everybody. Some people were doing the right thing, but as a general rule, we were on a timetable and we were pulling back according to a fixed timetable. We didn't have the leverage to interrupt that cycle. So we had to get in and prevent the cycle of Sunni attacking Shia, Shia attacking Sunni, and the Sunni community cementing itself behind extremists. So I went out on the ground, which was kind of like jumping off a cliff, you know, into the environment, set up these small patrol bases and engaged with the population and made deals.
You mean like taking over a house or a school and staying in the neighborhood and beginning to patrol?
What had happened was that during that really bad sectarian violence, little defense communities had formed. Like a village would have a couple of guys who got together to plan how to defend it. And we went in there, and I would often sit with people and I'd say, look, sorry about last year. You know, but we're back. We want to work with you to protect your village. Let's work out how to do that together. And we'd make these political deals at the local level, and then we'd figure out how to protect them. That was sort of a bottom-up approach, and you know, eventually we started to bite. But you know, I mean, I saw a guy yesterday who lost both his legs on the ground with us. You know, in the environment in the middle of 07. You know, it was a very dangerous environment. but mainly by partnering with the Iraqi people and making them feel safe enough to put the weapon down and start talking to each other instead of blowing each other up. That's how we kind of walked it back from the cliff.
Okay, and today we're seeing much lower levels of violence, but I want to ask you, if the worrying events of the last few weeks accelerate and turn into instability across heavily populated areas, maybe a return of sectarian violence, what can we in practice do?
Well, I think like I said, in 2006 we were on a timetable, we're drawing down, and we were losing leverage. That's exactly the situation that we're in now.
Again.
So I think we have to accept that there is a substantial risk that we may see an increase in violence. And we're already starting to see signs of that. But I think the key thing is the violence in 2006 was happening on our watch, and it was tearing the country apart. There could be a reasonable amount of violence in Iraq going forward, but if it doesn't threaten the integrity of the Iraqi state, if the Iraqis are able to handle it and control it themselves, then it's qualitatively different from the violence that we saw on our watch in 2006. I think the most dangerous outcome is that Iraq goes bad slowly, not quickly, because we're about to escalate and take a bunch of troops into Afghanistan. What if Iraq goes bad just as we're fully committed to Afghanistan? Then we have two Iraqs on our hands, and we don't have enough resources to deal with either, actually. So that's something that I think the Obama people are looking at. I think there was certainly in the first few weeks of the new administration a belief that we're done with Iraq, we can forget about it. I think the bombings of the last few weeks have got their attention again.
Well, President Obama was against the war, as we all know. He was against the surge. He seems to have now accepted the successes of the surge as a fact, and even gave a speech down at Camp Lejeune, which hailed the heroic work on the part of Marines and others in Iraq. Sort of has embraced the lessons of the last 2 years. Do you think, though, that he's going to spend capital, time, money, troops on a war that most Americans think is over for better or worse, or should be over, and that he himself has kept a certain distance from?
I think he's going to take what I would consider to be the right approach, which is a fairly pragmatic, fact-based approach to saying what's actually happening, what can we afford to do, and trying to balance these competing priorities.
Do you think that we have seen a sharp turn in American foreign policy since Obama took office? Certainly no one could deny that between 2003 and 2009, a great deal has changed. But what about between, say, 2007 or 8 and 2009? Have we seen as drastic a break as some of the other panels have described in domestic policy, like on healthcare or energy?
I think that there's actually a large amount of substantive policy continuity between the second term of the Bush administration and what we're seeing now. When I first came to work at the end of 2004 in the US government, I was an outcast. I was against the Iraq War. I wanted to change what we were doing, and there were things that you couldn't even write down in 2004 that were official policy signed by President Bush by last year. So there was this huge shift between 04 and 08. But one of my lessons out of that was international relations isn't engineering. You don't sit there and twiddle the knobs and fiddle with the levers and you change the settings. It's actually dating.
Dating. And for those of you who don't understand Australian, dating.
It's dating. I mean, the first date didn't go well, right? And so it didn't matter what the president said in the second term. For example, Guantanamo Bay. 9th of April 2006, President Bush said, "Let's close Guantanamo Bay." He made that statement, but no one was listening, because of what just happened in Iraq and Afghanistan.
So I think the first date didn't turn up the WMDs.
Exactly.
Basically.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so it turns out that who says things and how they're said in foreign policy is at least equally important to what they say. So I think the new president has an ability to get things done that the old president didn't have, even though the policies, in a lot of ways, not all, are broadly similar.
So you were a dissident whose views actually became, if not officially, unofficially, sort of the policy of the government. Now you're seeing Obama criticized for shaking hands with Hugo Chavez, for offering to talk to President Ahmadinejad with the right conditions, et cetera. You're an Army guy. You're not a softie. Do you think this is the right way to go, or what?
I think that America is so powerful militarily that everybody else in the world looks at us with a certain amount of caution and concern. So we have to demonstrate good intent. Otherwise, people have to treat us as a threat. So I think that this sort of détente approach that he's taking is the right way to go. But I sort of would return to Teddy Roosevelt, who's someone that whose life Obama is very familiar with, and who said, talk softly and carry a big stick. And I think that's kind of the approach that we'll see from this president.
Thanks a lot, Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you all.